Alright, I think the games we've been covering so far have been a little bit too mainstream. We're going to look at some more obscure stuff from the PlayStation's Japanese launch lineup over the next few episodes, starting with a game that you may not be familiar with, Tama, Adventurous Ball, and Giddy Labyrinth. Tama has the distinction of being a launch title for both the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn in Japan in 1994. The Saturn version launched alongside Sega's 32-bit console on November 22nd, while the PlayStation version hit retail a couple weeks later on December 9th. This highlights just how closely both systems were released alongside one another in Japan. The Saturn launched almost 4 months ahead of the PlayStation in North America in 1995, but for a number of reasons it didn't do Sega much good. If you were an early console adopter in Japan in 1994, though, Tama may have been one of the first games you played for either platform. So, what is Tama? Well, basically, it's a 3D 32-bit version of Atari's 1984 arcade game, Marble Madness. You guide a blue ball toward each level's goal while avoiding all the obstacles and enemy characters in your path. It's simple at first, but becomes more complicated when the game introduces things like seesaws and moving platforms. Unlike Marble Madness, you don't actually have direct control over the ball itself. Instead, you tilt and twist the playfield, using gravity and momentum to indirectly push the ball in the direction you want it to go. Tama might also take inspiration from Camel Try, a 1989 arcade game in which you used a dial controller to rotate background elements. It was later ported to the Super Nintendo under the title On the Ball. Similar games popped up every so often in the years afterward, including the GameCube launch titles Super Monkey Ball and Kororinpa Marble Mania, which is a surprisingly fun hidden gem type game for the Nintendo Wii. Going back even further, the whole ball-rolling maze game subgenre spawned from Labyrinth, a 1946 board game in which players tilted a wooden board to move a steel marble toward an exit while avoiding a series of holes in its path. The genre arguably reached its peak in popularity several years back with the release of the iPhone and iPod Touch, which led App Store developers to release a ton of marble-rolling games directly inspired by Labyrinth. These games use the iPhone's accelerometer for tilt controls, giving a fairly close approximation of the original board game. Now, while Tama's successors used advanced console and mobile hardware to great effect, Tama itself didn't achieve the same results. I guess in a way it's impressive that there's a rudimentary physics simulation at work here, but the trade-off is that the game runs very slowly. Tama was developed using pre-production Saturn and PlayStation hardware, and the frame rate takes a hit as a result. The presentation isn't all that great either. Gameplay uses flat-shaded polygons exclusively, and the intro and ending sequences are so plainly rendered that it's a little difficult to tell what's going on. Playing this, you get the feeling that the end result would have been much more impressive if it wasn't a launch title and its developers had prior experience with 32-bit hardware. That raises the question, who developed this thing? Well, Tama was created by Time Warner Interactive, who also did the Sega Saturn version of Virtua Racing and various ports of games like Primal Rage in the mid-90s. The studio didn't make much of an impact anywhere in the world, and seemed to disappear shortly after it started releasing games without any fanfare. Digging a little deeper, it turns out that Time Warner Interactive was previously known as Tengen. Yes, that Tengen, the company that released several unlicensed NES games and famously clashed with Nintendo over the console rights to Tetris. It's a long story, but for our purposes it suffices to say that Tengen was a subsidiary of arcade cabinet manufacturer Atari Games that focused on the home console market. During the 16-bit era, Tengen established a Japanese studio. Members of this team developed Sega Mega Drive games like Gauntlet 4, Grindstormer, and, most relevant to our discussion here, Marble Madness. It's interesting to note that this version of Marble Madness is a completely different game than the Marble Madness that Electronic Arts had previously released for the Mega Drive's North American counterpart, the Sega Genesis. The Mega Drive version was created by the Japanese team at Tengen, and both ports are different enough that you can tell them apart at a glance. The North American version of Marble Madness is infamous for its ear-splitting music, for instance. The Japanese edition made by Tengen is much more subdued in comparison. Tengen's Mega Drive version is also much closer to the original arcade game in terms of audio-visual presentation. The main takeaway here is that while the Electronic Arts version of Marble Madness was barely adequate, Tengen's adaptation was one of the best ports of Marble Madness available for any home console at the time. So, how does this all relate to Tama? Well, Tengen's Mega Drive version of Marble Madness was directed and programmed by a guy named Jun Amanai. Amanai remained with the studio when media conglomerate Time Warner purchased a majority stake in Atari Games in 1993 and changed Tengen's name to Time Warner Interactive. And the first project that Amanai directed under the newly rebranded Time Warner Interactive was, you guessed it, Tama, Adventurous Ball, and Giddy Labyrinth. Given the overlap in creative staff, you might think of Tama as a spiritual successor to Marble Madness. With Tama, Amanai built off his prior experience in developing the Mega Drive version of Marble Madness and spun it off in its own unique direction, using the capabilities of the Sega Saturn and PlayStation to render the whole thing in polygonal 3D. Time Warner Interactive didn't produce much in the years after Tama's release, and the studio was bought out again in 1996. This time it was Midway who rolled up Atari Games and Time Warner Interactive into Midway Games West. If nothing else, the Tengen link at least explains why there's Snow Brothers fan art in Tama's manual. See, Tengen published the Mega Drive version of Snow Brothers in 1993, and I guess this was a way to advertise the studio's legacy to any hardcore Tengen fans who may have bought Tama. With all that said, Tama isn't a terrible game. The controls take some getting used to, but if you can clear the game's second world, it doesn't get much more difficult after that. I guess the mazes are a little samey after a while, but it's engaging enough overall, and it doesn't overstay its welcome. Tama only has 30 levels, and you can beat them all in about an hour if you play on easy mode. Tama isn't much to look at nowadays though, and honestly, at this point you're probably better off playing something like Super Monkey Ball or Kororenpa. But, as a launch title for both the PlayStation and Sega Saturn, Tama gave us an early look at what we could expect from polygon-driven gameplay on both platforms. Plus, come on, you gotta love that title. Just keep your expectations in check, and keep in mind that the Labyrinth is not as giddy as advertised. Next up is something that I've been dreading. ArtDink's A-Train 4 Evolution. I'm not much for strategy games, so that should be interesting. We'll see how that turns out in the next episode. See you then.